Hello, welcome to World Civilizations up to 1500. Now, we're starting session 2 of the third topic of the semester titled Indo-Europeans and Hebrews in the Dawn of Empires and Universal Ideas. All right, so in this second session, we are proceeding now to look at part 2 of this topic. We're now going to look at the dawn of empires and universal ideas. In session 1, we looked at one particular group, the Indo-Europeans. This is a nomadic group that goes back thousands of years, of course, into the past in the ancient world, emerging in the region of Eurasia, the bridge between Europe and Asia, about 7500 BC, thereabouts. This is the region from which they're going to emerge, and at some point around 5000, 4000 BC, they're beginning to spread out into different areas of the world. We looked at their migrations. Some of them moved into Europe, and they're going to form the different European groups of Europe, like the Celts, for example, the Germanic tribes, the Scandinavian, the Southern European groups, like the Greeks, the Mycenaeans, the Romans, or the Italians, and so on. We looked at that. We also looked at their migrations into Asia Minor, Anatolia, as it was called, present-day Turkey, yet others moved into the east to settle in areas of the Middle East like modern-day Iran. They're going to be the founders of Persia, and also other groups of the Indo-Europeans moved all the way to the Indian subcontinent. So we looked again rather briefly in session 1 at their social structures, their political organization as well, their religious worldview, and the like. It's just to understand very clearly those societies and their cultures of those nomadic groups. And as I mentioned, the Indo-Europeans are going to have a profound effect on the river civilizations we looked at in the second topic of the semester, in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, and they're going to alter in very significant ways the emergent civilizations of those regions. So let us now look at our lecture outline, and this is part 2, and now we're going to see the impact that the nomadic groups, the Indo-Europeans, are going to exert upon one particular region of the world, and that's going to be the Near East in this case. And they're going to, through their interactions and through their influence, cultural influence, political influence, if you will, are going to really shape the emergent civilizations of Mesopotamia, but also of Egypt. And we're going to see now the rise of something new in world history, and that is the rise of empires. Again, this is a rise of imperialism, and for the first time, some of those empires are going to grow significantly territorially, that they're going to become the so-called the very first world empires. Okay, those were just gigantic political structures, again, that encompassed hundreds and hundreds of different linguistic groups governed by a core city, called a world empire. Now, just as an introduction to this segment, the dawn of empires, as I mentioned in session 1, the nomadic groups are going to really play a key role in shaping the history of civilizations. As I mentioned, civilizations are not developing in splendid isolation from the rest of the world. As I mentioned, the vast majority of the world population are still nomads, It is only really a tiny fraction of the world population that are entering this new phase of civilization, as I mentioned. And as we'll see, the nomads, which really constituted the vast majority of humanity, surrounded the civilizations on all sides. And although sometimes the relationships between the nomads and the civilizations were peaceful, and they engaged in trade and so on, from time to time, the nomads also altered those relationships, and during times of droughts or scarcity and limited resources, out of desperation, the nomads are going to press on the civilizations. They're going to raid them. They're going to wage war on them. And this is going to alter the character, the nature of the civilizations that they're invading. And this is going to set another course for those civilizations to follow. And in many cases, that course is going to be empire. The solution to the nomadic invasions will be to create an empire. Again, a culture of war, of defense, to defend the people of the civilizations against the nomads. And in that process, those civilizations will become more imperialistic. Now, the nomadic invasions that we're going to be looking at, that were carried out very early on in the ancient world, their contribution to the history of civilization is that those nomadic invasions, the ones that we're going to get to see in this segment, are going to cause one particular phenomenon. And that is that the nomadic invasions are going to shatter the idea within the civilizations that they're invading, the idea that those civilizations were eternal. Because initially, that was really the perception of, let's say, the ancient Egyptians or the ancient Sumerians, for example, is that their civilizations were so sophisticated, so stable in so many regards, that they believed that their cities, their political systems, their monarchies, for example, that they were there to last forever. Ultimately, the pharaohs of ancient Egypt and the Sumerian kings were connected to the gods. In many cases, they were seen as the representatives or even the embodiments of the gods. So those were divine figures that were supposed to maintain the civilizations for a long, long time, perhaps even for eternity. There was a certain sense of stability that people perceived inside of those cities. Those were ultimately the largest, really, creations of humanity. They were very sophisticated, very advanced on so many levels, and people really perceived that those civilizations were there to last forever. And this is exactly what the nomads are going to alter and shatter. This idea that the political systems, the monarchies, and their cities were eternal. They were not. People gained the sense right away that something had to be done in order to preserve their societies. And instead of just, worrying about their daily work and tending animals and growing crops and paying tribute and worshiping the gods, as usual, people believed that the civilizations needed to take another course, and the other course is that, we need to learn about war. We need skills. We need an army. And we need a state that is going to protect us, a more warring state, in other words. So the nomads are going to, on one hand, shatter the eternal state, but on the other, they're going to transform those ancient states into warring states. And again, those are going to become engines of conquest, as we'll see. Again, this is going to be one of the main issues, again, that we're going to be looking at very closely across this segment, this session, the dawn of empires. All right, so this is something new occurring in world history. With the dawn of civilizations, we're also going to see the dawn of empires as the nomads are beginning to pour into those civilizations. Once again, in many cases, they're seeking crops and animals. They're seeking food or treasure, and this is going to create the first empires of the world. And the first empires in world history are emerging very early on in the ancient world in a time period from 2400 BC all the way to 330 BC. This is not to say that there will be no more empires to come after 330 BC. No, that's not the case. There will be yet others and much larger empires we're going to be looking at later on in the semester, of course. But this is the first instance where the first series, the first wave of empires are emerging. And in many cases, those were really improvised systems, if you will. People were improvising, they were forming them. Nobody knew how to actually forge an empire. So there's going to be a lot of trial and error, experimentation. So this is a time of great experimentation, if you will, with, building empires. We're going to get to see in this segment 3 different empires, series of empires. In Mesopotamia, for example, we're going to be looking at, first and foremost, the Semitic empires. And when we mean Semitic, as we'll see, is that the peoples that actually formed those empires constituted peoples that belong to a linguistic group known as the Semitic group, the Semitic languages, in other words. And this is in Mesopotamia proper. We're going to look at the Akkadian Empire emerging in Mesopotamia, the Babylonian Empire, and the Assyrian Empire. Those are the empires that are emerging very, very early on in world history. In the Near East, this is the geographical region that gave birth to the first empires in world history, the Near East. What today is just commonly and generically called the Middle East, that is to say. This is the cradle of those new political systems. Within the Middle East, there's going to be other kinds of empires, the Indo-European empires. 2 different Indo-European empires we're going to get to see, the Hittites, for example, the Hittite Empire and the Persian Empire. Those were Indo-Europeans. Once again, this is another linguistic group, the ones we actually examined in session 1. And also in Northeast Africa, we're going to see the Egyptian civilization as well, looking at the empire as well. Now, this is not going to be an exhaustive presentation of each one of those empires, but rather we're going to see the reasons why they were formed and how those empires innovated new ideas, new institutions in order to form the empire, and in doing so, they're going to give rise to what is called universal principles, universal ideas, universal institutions, and universal religions as well. So this is the first time that we're going to get to see ideas, institutions, or religions that were intended to govern large geographical areas, a multiplicity of different ethnic and linguistic groups, all to be governed by a single institution or religion or idea, that is to say. So this is what we're going to be paying attention as we're examining those empires, okay? So those are the 3 main sectors we're going to be examining in this session. This is a map, so you can see the geography of the Near East, as it is often called, otherwise known as the Middle East. The empires are going to be really flourishing along the 2 rivers of Mesopotamia, as we'll see, and they're going to encompass also the region of Asia Minor or Anatolia, and we're going to look also here in Northeast Africa at Egypt. All of this region constituted the Near East. And this is going to be the home of the very first series of empires we're going to look at. All right. Now, it is very important to note as well that those emerging empires faced a series of challenges that they needed to solve in the process, of course, forming those imperial systems. They face significant challenges. Okay. Ultimately, again, this is something new. Prior to this time, there were no empires anywhere around the world. There were really small communities. Some were farming communities. Others were the civilizations we looked at in the past, the cities and so on. But the idea that there was going to be, for example, one strong city that was going to expand its control over large geographical areas to dominate other communities, cities, or villages and so on from the core city was totally unknown. So this is the very first time we're going to get to see, again, something new. And in the process, those imperial systems are going to face significant challenges. For example, the most common will be, for example, transportation and communication systems that were not developed during this time, and is going to present a difficulty for one core city that is bent on expansion and trying to incorporate tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands of people across a vast area, for those people to be governed by a king that is ruling from the core city. So this is going to be one of those challenges, one of those difficulties, is that, well, there's no transportation systems, and communication also is not very developed or well developed in the ancient world. So the difficulty to transmit messages, for example, to transport products, because this is exactly what empires are doing. They're extracting tribute, they're extracting resources from all of the communities that they're controlling. This is going to be very difficult, you know. So this is something that had to be resolved by those emerging empires, you know, to develop a system of communication and transportation. So you see how those empires are beginning to transform human societies, because they're going to be the pioneers of the very first systems of transportation and communication. They had a challenge to solve. If they were to govern large areas, they needed to solve that problem. Revenue collection, that's another challenge. You know, empires cannot be really sustained without a collection of tribute or taxes. This is also something that empires innovated. They will have to devise new systems of revenue collection to sustain the empire, to sustain, for example, the imperial army. The imperial army is the one that is marching into different areas and then controlling them, extracting tribute, and also kind of maintaining order as well. So there's going to be, of course, the need to sustain the troops, and that only comes from collecting taxes. This is something that empires also were challenged, and they will have to innovate, of course, new systems of revenue collection. The other challenge is that from time to time there will be resistance against the empire. You know, this is not to say that when a city was conquered by a neighboring city, the conquered city was not going to rise up eventually against their masters. That often happened. There was discontent always among the colonized, among the people that were dominated by the core city, and there were constant uprisings and rebellions. This was yet another issue that the empires needed to resolve. And there will be, of course, certain mechanisms that those imperial systems devised in order to try to control those rebellions. Of course, this is going to be an impossible mission, controlling rebellions and uprising again. But nonetheless, over time, over the course of centuries and millennia, those imperial systems were able to experiment with different tactics for actually pacifying rebellions. And we're going to get to see that, of course, in this segment as well. At the same time, another challenge was that as those empires expanded significantly across vast areas, they became quite unmanageable. Because as empires expand, there was the need to create, of course, different agencies, different institutions to administer the empire. A single city, which was really the core city that dominated the entire empire, could not really do it by itself. Ultimately, they needed to expand and create certain agencies outside of the city in order to carry out the administration of tax collection, for example, of raising armies, stationing in different points of the empire, and the like. They needed to create a sophisticated bureaucracy, something that they lacked initially. When those empires were forged, they lacked a sophisticated bureaucracy. It was a challenge, and as we'll see, this is something that they're going to start innovating and, to a certain degree, perfecting over the course of time. Those were some of the challenges that they're going to face, and this is going to press them to pursue different solutions, and in the process, they're going to be innovating, of course, new ideas. And indeed, this is exactly what empires created in the process of trying to meet those challenges in order to effectively govern hundreds of thousands of people in vast geographical areas. Empires ultimately created universal ideas and institutions. This is their biggest contribution to human history. Again, that in the process of building those imperial systems, empires were the forerunners of universals, as they're called, the universal ideas and universal institutions. For example, a system of laws. Well, if one city is going to govern an entire area that encompasses hundreds and hundreds of miles, encompassing a wide variety of different linguistic and ethnic groups and so on, well, you need uniformity. In other words, people need to understand that they are now being governed by this political entity far away, and that this political entity is now controlling the entire empire, and the empires needed to then devise a system of laws for everybody to follow. What are going to be the laws that everybody, regardless of the region where you live, the community, your customs, your traditions, in many cases people were guided by tribal traditions and so on. Well, that's all fine. But now the empires are going to introduce something new. And that is, yes, you can carry out your tribal, you can obey your tribal customs and the like, but now there's going to be a law, a universal law that everybody must follow. There are certain laws that people must obey, otherwise they're going to face penalties, and this goes for everybody, regardless of, again, customs and culture, religion, and the like. So we're going to see, again, imperial laws, for example. Those are one of the universal ideas that empires gave birth to. Also, in order to create unity among the empires also endeavored to create a common sense of identity. This was a way to maintain stability because the peoples of the empire were rather diverse, very diverse in so many ways. So empires try to create stability and order, not only by imposing laws that will apply for everybody else, but also they were endeavoring to create a common sense of identity. So people can see themselves as members of a single community. So they endeavor to create a single culture, what is called cultural and ethnic unity. Promote the idea that, yes, we are very diverse and the like, we might speak different languages and the like, but empires promoted certain set of cultural ideas for everybody to follow. And in this way, they were trying to create a common sense of identity, that we all share a common culture, we all share a common background, an ethnic background, and they were trying to instill those ideas in people's minds in so many different ways, sometimes peaceful, sometimes through coercion, of course, but they were trying to mold the minds of the population in order for people to accept a set of cultural norms, cultural ideas. Sometimes there were linguistic ideas or certain customs and so on for everybody to follow. And in that way, people could come together and actually support the empire, because ultimately people said, well, we are all, are members of the empire. We share a common culture. We're one common people, one community, that is to say. Empires also try to create unity within the empire by promoting a single religious cult. But instead of trying to promote a religion to worship a multiplicity of gods, the way people were accustomed to all over the world, without exception, people worshipped a multiplicity of gods. Okay, and that was the norm. Every community had a multiplicity of gods, and in many cases they maybe favor one god over another. But people really understood that there were so many forces in creation, so many creator gods and goddesses, and again, it was just a matter of preference. Sometimes it was a matter of understanding which of the gods or the forces were more important to the community and the like. But once we see the rise of empires, those empires came to the conclusion that in order to create stability and to legitimize the authority of the emperor, that it will be more convenient to promote the idea of worshiping a single god. Empires, as we'll see, were known for introducing to the world the idea that in reality there's only one God. Okay, there's only one God. This is called monotheism. Okay, unifying the peoples of the empire through a single cult centered on the worship of a single supreme divine being who is the creator of the world and is the creator of the empire. Okay, and that facilitated people coming together and creating, of course, a sense of identity through the worship of a single divine being, and with that creating a stable, more orderly society within the empire. That was, again, the idea. So we can conclude that monotheism, this idea of worshiping a single supreme being, that the idea that there's only one God, instead of having a multiplicity of gods, that in reality there's only one God. All these other gods that people pray to, they're really non-existent. In monotheism, the idea is that there's only one God, not many. Okay, that is the idea. Monotheism, historically speaking, is really the outcome of the nomadic invasions. You see, you have to be able to see the cause and effect of the nomadic invasions against the civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia, in that what the nomadic invasions are leading up to is not just that they're causing those civilizations to transform themselves into war machines, into empires, but at the same time, those nomadic invasions cause those empires to innovate something new, and that is the idea of a single God. So that is really the consequence of the nomadic invasions, again, in that it produced monotheism eventually. Monotheism, again, was the solution for the problem of diversity within an imperial system that threatened people to fight with one another or to create tensions between different communities that worship different gods, and it threatened the imperial system in breaking it apart. So in order to bring people together and for people to stop fighting with one another, they introduced the idea that, well, there's only one God, let's all come together and just worship this God. Okay? This God is the king of the universe, and this God gave the emperor the authority to govern the empire. So you see, monotheism is really an expression of this new historical stage of empires. Okay? It is only when we see the rise of empires that we're going to see the rise of monotheism. Oh, well, there's only an emperor ruling a vast area. There must be, just like the emperor, one single God ruling over the universe. That was the perception. That is the conclusion, the logical conclusion, if you will, back in the ancient world, that there must be a supreme being who is just like the emperor of the cosmos, the emperor of the universe. Now, monotheism had significant problems. It was not that easy to introduce monotheism in the ancient world, and people simply just discarding their old gods, their tribal gods, and suddenly embracing a single supreme being without, having any psychological or philosophical problems. People had a lot of psychological and philosophical problems understanding and accepting the idea of monotheism of a single God. Significant problems. And in many cases, people resisted the idea of worshiping a single God. It was not that easy. And the reason for that has to do with the fact that people had in the ancient world a lot of trouble understanding how there could only be a single supreme being in the universe when in the world of time and space, in this material world of experience, people constantly perceive and experience forces that are very opposite to one another. For example, now this is called duality, for example. People experience heat and cold. Those are opposites. How can, one single supreme being can be the source of heat and cold, they will say, or night and day, or goodness and evil. You experience goodness in the world whenever everything goes right, for example. When everything goes right, you might say, oh, this is a blessing of the gods, you might say. But when things go wrong, when there's catastrophes, when people die, when there's sickness and disease and famine, etc., people will ascribe those things to other gods. Oh, we're suffering, we're dying, etc., because those are actually the wicked forces at work. Those are the bad spirits, the evil gods, and so on, or the gods of rage and so on that are sending this. So this is one of the reasons that people had so many gods in the past, is because people experienced so many diverse kinds of experiences in the world, the good experiences and the bad experiences. So they believed that everything that happened in the world was the consequence of many different gods and goddesses that were producing them, like light, darkness, day and night, heat and cold, life and death, for example, or abundance and destruction and so on. There were many opposite forces, opposite experiences, and therefore people ascribe those opposite experiences coming from different, of course, beings. That is why, again, there was a multiplicity of gods in the ancient world. So to suddenly introduce the idea that there's only one God, there's only a single supreme being that is in charge of everything, that poses a problem. Because ultimately what people are saying, how is it that the same God that is bringing life, that is bringing health, that is bringing crops and abundance, is the same God that brings us death or crop failures, or brings us famines and floodings and the like? How is it that a single supreme being can actually be in charge of both? That was the main problem of monotheism. So despite the fact that the empires introduced monotheism in the world, it was not easy for people to actually embrace monotheism right away. It takes a lot of psychological and philosophical courage to actually go beyond this idea of, well, I cannot understand how good and bad comes from a supreme being. It really takes a lot of courage and say, well, in reality, that's the way, life works. There's only one universe, there's only one single spirit, there's only a single creator for everything, and that single creator is producing everything in the world. And it's not that easy. So empires did not have it easy, again, introducing new ideas, new universal ideas like monotheism. Empires, besides innovating the very first universal ideas and institutions, were also propagators of culture as well. This is one of the functions of empires very early on, is that they tended to spread their own cultural ideas not only across the empire but even beyond the empire as well. They were trying to diffuse and propagate, spread their culture far and wide across the known world, even beyond their own borders, beyond their own domain. They were trying to spread them far and wide. And in many cases, they were doing that consciously, through policy and trying to spread their culture, of course. But in other instances, they were also doing that indirectly as a result of the trade that they were engaged in with other empires or with other societies outside of their own imperial systems. Empires, one of the main concerns of the empires was trade. Okay? They tried to not only extract tribute from their communities and cities that they dominated, but they also tried to extend their commercial networks beyond their own domains in order to facilitate also the exchange of products back and forth from their own cities with neighboring empires. That way they will actually increase their revenues as well. So they try to also, once again, promote this idea of building trading networks with other societies outside of their own domain. And there will be, of course, new trade routes and roads, as we'll see, that they are going to build for this process. And in doing so, what they're going to be doing is that as merchants are traveling across those routes and roads, bringing goods from one location to another. Those merchants are also going to be carrying, along with the merchandise that they're carrying, they're also going to be carrying cultural ideas as well. So across the Near East, what we're going to see is the diffusion of culture. The empires are going to diffuse their cultures along those straight routes, their languages, their customs, their political ideas, for example, their technologies. All of those cultural ideas are going to be diffused across the Near East, particularly the Sumerian ideas of southern Mesopotamia that emerged very early on, something we looked at in the second topic. The Sumerian ideas are going to be diffused across the Near East, far and wide in every direction. As we see a series of empires flourishing in Mesopotamia, they're going to absorb the culture of Sumer, and as they expanded geographically and build trade routes and so on, they're going to be diffusing Sumerian culture. And this is how we're going to see the culture of ancient Sumer becoming the standard culture across the Near East, with the only exception perhaps of ancient Egypt, that pretty much sustained its own distinct culture in Northeast Africa. But outside of Egypt, again, the entire region of the Near East is going to really absorb Sumerian culture. All right, so now let's look at the first wave of empires. In this case, we're looking at this in Mesopotamia proper. There will be three particular empires we're going to look at: the Akkadian, for example, the Babylonian, and the Assyrian Empire. They're called the Semitic Empires because those empires were forged by groups of people that belong to a linguistic group known as the Semitic group. So it is very, very important to look at the geography of Mesopotamia, first and foremost, to look at the emergence of the Semitic empires and look at, for example, their demographics, the different groups that inhabited this region that are going to forge those empires. So let's look at the demographics. As I mentioned, the first wave of empires that flourished in Mesopotamia were the Semitic empires. And they're called the Semitic empires once again because those empires were forged by the Semitic peoples. You know, they are a linguistic group. They come from the Semitic language. And according to linguistics, certain scholars that study, of course, ancient languages and the like, the Semitic peoples of the Near East that inhabit this region of Mesopotamia go back to groups of people that came from Africa. Once again, so the very early origins of the Semitic peoples of Mesopotamia really come from Africa. So you can see in this map, for example, the regions of Africa that had the direct connections with the Middle East in terms of linguistics. There is a Semitic, in other words, root language that they all share in common. And of course, the different linguistic groups that are Semitic might have very significant differences with one another in terms of the languages, but they're all of those languages are connected to the root language, the Semitic language. This is something similar to what we discussed in session 1 with the Indo-Europeans, for example. We talked about how the Indo-Europeans are also a linguistic group that once upon a time spoke a single language. It was called Sanskrit. And as the Indo-Europeans disbanded and went in different directions, they took that Sanskrit language and modified it to a certain degree and created different variations, of course, like Greek, for example, and Latin and German, Scandinavian, and so on, Persian, and so on, but they're all descent from Sanskrit. Likewise, the Semitic language constitute another root language that comes from Africa. You can see it across the north and northeast Africa as well. And that language extended into the Near East in the Arabian Peninsula, for example. So the Arabian language is also Semitic, including the Hebrew language as well. The Hebrews, in other words, are also a Semitic group. The Akkadians, the Babylonians, for example, the Assyrians, all of those groups are Semitic, again, because they share a common root language, which is the Semitic language. They tend to, in Mesopotamia, inhabited the north part of Mesopotamia. Remember, the south part of Mesopotamia was inhabited by the Sumerians, and the Sumerians were not considered Semitic. They spoke a different language that was not connected to the Semitic language. It's very important. So the Semitic peoples are just north of Sumeria. North of Sumeria. In Mesopotamia, the Semitic peoples, before they entered the process of civilization and empire building, they were nomadic. They were herders. They were herding, sheep and goat and cattle and the like in that region. And they were also known for their skills in warfare as well. So primarily they were pastoralists, as we mentioned. They tended animals, they raised, sheep and goats, etc. That was their livelihood. But of course, there were conflicts between different tribal groups, and they often resorted to warfare as well. Now, their skills in warfare were intensified and to a certain degree perfected by their rivalries with the Indo-Europeans that are beginning to pour into this region as early as 2700 BC. Remember, this is one of the first incursions of the Indo-Europeans, who are also nomadic. They have a culture around war as well. And some of the Indo-Europeans that are beginning to arrive are the Hittites, that we mentioned in Asia Minor, for example. There will be others that are going to be moving into also Mesopotamia, northern Mesopotamia. They're going to become later on the Persians as well. They're nomadic and they practice warfare as well. And so, due to the fact that there are, of course, incursions, the Indo-Europeans moving into the Near East, there's going to be intense rivalries between the Semitic peoples that inhabited this region and, of course, now the newcomers, the Indo-Europeans. And out of those interactions, there will be rivalries, there will be conflict, and out of that conflict, the Semitic peoples are going to acquire more and more skills in warfare. And in many cases, they're going to be adopting the techniques, the strategies, the technologies of the Indo-Europeans, and they're going to use them to start building their cities, of course. And they're going to be building a series of cities in northern Mesopotamia, just north of Sumer. And those cities are taking a whole different character. They're very different from the Sumerian cities to the south. The new Semitic cities to the north that are emerging, they're more warlike, if you will. Okay? Those cities are cities built by the Semitic groups that were formerly just herders or pastoralists. They're entering the city life, they're stationing themselves along the river, they're beginning to farm and the like, but they have now acquired significant skills in warfare. And they're now beginning to build a new kind of city, a city that has, of course, defense walls, and they're going to start raising armies because they're going to become very, very competitive with one another. This is going to be the nature and the character of the Semitic cities of northern Mesopotamia. Again, that those are cities that are competing with one another over territories, over resources, and they're constantly invading one another. Because again, this is their experience, historical experience in the past, as they were competing with other tribal groups, but also with the Indo-Europeans that were arriving. This is going to produce, again, something new. Again, the warring city, if you will. Another aspect of the geographical background of Mesopotamia that led to the Semitic empires was the environment. The Mesopotamian environment, as I mentioned in the second topic, is one in which there's really no natural barriers across Mesopotamia. This is an open landscape. There are no internal boundaries necessarily, like, for example, Egypt was protected on all sides by deserts and mountains and, the oceans and the like. A civilization that was preserved for thousands of years due to those barriers. But here, the landscape is pretty much open. So as we see the emergence of those Semitic cities, as we mentioned, the fact is that there's nothing stopping an army from actually marching and actually raiding and invading a neighboring city. There are no natural barriers. So those cities are pretty much unprotected by the environment. They're going to have to protect themselves. They're going to have to build defense systems and armies in order to protect themselves and compete with their neighbors. So you can see how the environment is shaping the nature and the size of the political states of Mesopotamia. This is very, very important. The environment in many cases play a key role in how a certain community, a certain society is going to conduct itself and what is going to be the purpose, the goal of that community or that city. In this case, what we're seeing is, of course, warfare. Okay, it will be easy to wage war and invade your neighbor and expand almost without any opposition by nature. Okay, it's just an open field, in other words. This facilitates not only cities invading each other, but also nomadic invasions. They're still nomads. They're still nomadic tribes. And from time to time, as I mentioned, they're going to be raiding those cities as well. Whenever things, again, go wrong in the environment and so on, the nomads will become very active and they're going to be invading those cities. Ultimately, there's nothing stopping the nomads from invading the cities. There are no natural barriers. Once again, the environment is pretty much setting the stage for this. Wars in this region of the world will be wars to actually scramble for limited resources. This is, again, the situation. This is not a region that provides an overabundance of resources. Resources are very scarce. So, because the environment provides very limited resources, cities must compete for those limited resources with their neighbors. So, war becomes the natural way for competing for those resources. So war will become the norm. So again, war is becoming part of the culture of the emerging Semitic cities of northern Mesopotamia. And this is going to lead to empires governed by monarchs. Ultimately, there were already monarchies, of course, in southern Mesopotamia. For example, in Sumer, we see the emergence of the institution of the monarchy. And this monarchy is going to become the primary political system of the emergent empires and the engine of conquest as well. The emerging kings are not going to be ordinary kings like, for example, in ancient Sumer, that were priests, for example, that were governing the realm on behalf of the gods. Here, in the Semitic cities that are going to now become the new empires of Mesopotamia and in the Near East, those kings are going to emerge as divine kings. They're going to claim divine status. Those monarchs are going to claim that they are indeed gods themselves. And those are warrior kings, by the way. They're divine. They are indeed living gods. And they're going to command armies to expand and wage war against their neighbors and build large imperial systems. This is a time, again, when in northern Mesopotamia, as we see the rise of those empires, societies are going to be divided quite easily between, of course, the monarch, who is a god, and the rest of society, who are just slaves. That was the idea, again, in this new society, in this new imperial order. And everybody must just, serve the god, pay tribute to the god, because ultimately we're all just slaves to the gods, in other words. So with this new status of divinity, those monarchical empires are going to be very prone to expansionism. Ultimately, what the god or the king said was really, again, law. And so they're going to have a very intense desire to expand, because ultimately they really believed that they were gods. And so they wanted to expand their frontiers as much as possible. Just like any god will like to pretty much expand their control and domination over the entire universe. So this is going to provide now the perfect setting to start experimenting with empire building. This is really a laboratory for empire building. Northern Mesopotamia, those Semitic cities, are going to be experimenting with empire building as they're now expanding their domination across hundreds and hundreds of miles far and wide. The first Semitic empire that flourished in Mesopotamia was the Akkadian Empire in the city of Akkad. So again, this is really a Semitic city, and the city was the city of Akkad. This is an empire that flourished from 2400 BC and spanned all the way to 2150 BC. Did not last very long. We're looking at about 3 centuries, give and take. But nonetheless, again, because there were no empires in the ancient world up to this time, this was really a remarkable achievement by the standards of the time. So it is one of those Semitic cities that saw now the rise of a central figure. There was going to be a strong man. In this case, his name is going to be Sargon of Akkad. He's going to be the founder of the Akkadian Empire. Sargon of Akkad, he was called. He's going to be the one seizing power by force. He overthrew one of the monarchs of the city. He installed himself as ruler, and he declared himself pretty much, again, a divine king. He's a warrior. He's going to raise a large army, and he's going to be expanding his army in all directions at once, conquering their neighbors one by one, and created, again, a vast empire. Just to go back to the map, that encompassed really all of Mesopotamia, including certain portions of Asia Minor, as you can see here, what was called Anatolia as well, outside of Mesopotamia. Again, it was a vast empire that conquered all of Mesopotamia, including ancient Sumer here to the south. Okay, the first empire in world history, forged by Sargon of Akkad, who becomes like a god king, so to speak. And he's really conquering all the city-states across this region. You know, this marked the end of Sumer, of Sumerian civilization, although Akkad adopts the culture of Sumer, and he exports this, the Sumerian culture across the empire. So despite the fact that this gave rise to the end of Sumer, nonetheless, this empire ended up pretty much expanding Sumerian culture across the region. Particularly, for example, the religion, in this case, the religion of Sumer. You know, once again, this marked the beginning of divine kinship. You know, he is indeed an emperor, but he is a divine emperor. He's considered to be a god. You know, the god king indicates that he is indeed at the very top, at the very pinnacle of society, and everybody else, including his most close associates and administrators, were all considered slaves in this case. He's the one that created the first unified standing army. So this is one of the first innovations. Remember, we're looking at new institutions, universal ideas, and so on. So he's really forging a unified standing army. This is no longer just an army that is raised in case of emergency for defense purposes, but it's a permanent army. And it's a large unified army that is marching from city to city, conquering them, subduing them, and imposing, of course, tribute on each one of them, to pay tribute to Akkad in this case, or to the city of Akkad. He's really Sargon of Akkad and the subsequent emperors that came after him innovated also the first postal system. Well, remember, you know, there was a challenge during this time, and that was the challenge of communication. You need to have a system of communication between all the constituent parts of the empire. You need to have news, reports, to inform the emperors of what is occurring across the realm. And again, they innovated the very first postal system. And that was considered to be, again, a very important innovation in human history, to facilitate communication, to provide news and reports of rebellions, for example, in order to dispatch an army, and so on. Another mechanism to govern this very large empire that consisted of a multiplicity of cities and communities and peoples was to place governors and administrators across the realm that were close to the emperor. This is called nepotism. Appointing, for example, siblings, close relatives and family members as city governors, and also priestess as well, conducting the main ceremonies of the temple. So once again, every city that was conquered, what the city of Akkad did is that it removed the monarch from the city and installed a close relative or family member to govern that city. That way you create a certain sympathy and loyalty to the empire. You know, the cities are not going to be self-ruled or governed and just pay tribute to the city of Akkad. No. You know, the city of Akkad want to make sure that in order to subdue the people of all of those cities and control them and control rebellions, you need somebody very loyal to the empire. And who else than, you know, a close family member of the emperor? in other words. That will be controlling the political functions of the cities, but also controlling the religious functions as well, controlling the cults and the like. They were also, again, the family of the emperor were marrying into the city elites as well. Every city had, of course, certain families that controlled the domain, and what you wanted is to build networks with them and marry into the elites of each city. So therefore, you're building a strong family network across the realm. And with that, you're creating a certain sense of loyalty and stability. Okay? So this is really, again, an innovation. Another Semitic empire was the Babylonian Empire. It flourished from 2000 to 1600 BC. It came after the Akkadian Empire. After it collapsed, we're going to see another city emerging in prominence, in might, and that is Babylon. The city of Babylon, again, in the year 2000, is pretty much continuing this process of empire building the way Akkad built it. Now the Babylonians enter this phase, and they also expand their borders far and wide, pretty much displace the Akkadian system and now restore it now under the control, the domain of Babylon, pretty much. Okay, this is the Babylonian Empire. They were known, as I mentioned in the second topic, for introducing the first written laws. Once again, the empire needed a certain system for all people to come together and follow a standard norm, in other words. So instead of obeying their own tribal customs and so on, to create a sense of unity, to create stability and loyalty, if you will, and order, they created the very first so-called constitution that everybody must follow. A system of laws, a written laws. In this case, this is a system of laws created by Hammurabi. Hammurabi was the first Babylonian emperor who created the first law code in order for all the cities of the empire to actually follow. So they're creating a standardized system, again, to unify the empire, in other words. It provided, again, very clear indications about what is the status, for example, of merchants, even the status of women, what were their rights, even slaves, for example, what was the status of the slaves and so on, commercial transactions, tax codes, and so on. All of that was very clearly indicated, and it was, again, something that everybody had to follow as well. And in order to make sure that people were following those norms, he created a system of judges as well. Again, across the realm, there will be courts where the judges were going to be judging cases related to the Hammurabi law code. People that were breaking the law are going to be judged, in other words, according to the new laws and the like. So again, this is something new. This is a whole new innovation emerging in the ancient world. And of course, this is something that is going to be expanded and perfected over time to the point that today, again, we still continue with the system of judges, as well. The other Semitic empire was the Assyrian Empire. This came after the Babylonian Empire, and the lifespan of the Assyrian Empire was from 900 to 600 BC. This is another city, is the city of Ashur, as it was called. And this is why it's called the Assyrian Empire, from the city of Ashur. Again, it's another Semitic city. That is also going to expand. And in this case, the Assyrians also expanded their control over Egypt. They invaded and actually occupied and ruled Egypt as well. It was a vast land-based empire in the Near East as well. The Assyrians is a very interesting case study in that as I mentioned, they're Semitic peoples. Their background was nomadic. They developed a warrior culture from their constant interactions and conflicts with the Hittites, this Indo-European group that installed in Asia Minor. So we can have, of course, a visual. Let me just go back to this map. Once again, this is Anatolia or Asia Minor, the region where the Hittites built their culture. And because they were, nomads and warriors, the Assyrians, the Semitic group that inhabited this region, were in constant war with the Hittites. And for 1,000 years, they were fighting the Hittites, and eventually they became so skilled in warfare, they adopted the chariot, the war chariot from the Hittites, and their techniques and skills. And so they became so sophisticated in the art of war that once they built a city, the city of Ashur, which is one of the major gods of the Assyrians, their city is going to devote all their energies to the art of war, and they're going to pretty much conquer the entire region, and they were also able to conquer Egypt as well. The Assyrians, as they built their empire, they were trying to unify all peoples through a single religious cult. So they practiced what is called religious imperialism, meaning that as they expanded from one area to another, they were imposing their religious cults on all of the society that they govern. Okay, that was their idea of trying to bring people together and trying to make them loyal to the city of Ashur, imposing again the worship of the god Ashur in this case, and try to ban all of the other tribal cults and religions of the realm. They had a large standing army, and that standing army was rather fanatical. In other words, imposing a universal religion, trying to impose also a universal culture, and they were very ruthless in their techniques, in their activities in warfare. In many cases, they were deporting people, kidnapping, for example, peoples, reconcentrating populations, making them live in certain areas so they can be supervised very closely, and so they can actually practice the cult of Ashur as well. Again, so in this process, they were destroying communities. They were kidnapping not only people, but they were also kidnapping their gods, abolishing religious cults, and taking the gods away from peoples and imposing a new faith. Again, it was a brutal form of governance that they practiced. In many cases, they practiced what is called public terror, meaning that whenever people revolted against the Assyrians, one way that they tried to quell the rebellion was by terrorizing the population and pretty much massacring populations in public spectacles for everybody to see, in order to intimidate people and terrorize them to prevent future uprisings from occurring. So they practice what is called public terror. So they're considered one of the most, again, ruthless empires in the ancient world, the Assyrians. The other Semitic empire is also a Babylonian empire, but this is another group that took over after the fall of the Assyrian Empire. We're going to see the city of Babylon rising up once again, but this time there is yet another group known as the Chaldeans, as they're called, and they're going to resurrect the old Babylonian Empire and create a new Babylonian Empire. It was called the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Didn't last very long, from 626 to 539 BC. They also, again, expanded across the Eastern Mediterranean, parts of the Arabian Peninsula, the entire Mesopotamian region was expanded across, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. This is the time when we hear stories about the Babel Tower, for example. Again, comes to us from the writings of the ancient Hebrews in the Old Testament, for example. The Neo-Babylonians were astronomers. They were peoples that observed the sky, and they really wanted to understand time and the cycles of time. They began to pretty much form calendars and perfect the calendars, and that was one of their main preoccupations. Now, during the Neo-Babylonian period, what we see is also the attempt to try to create a uniform religious cult. The king of Babylon, Nabonidus, as he was called, who ruled from 556 to 538 BC, tried to institute a religious cult that will be a cult for everybody to follow, the worshipping of a single god, and that was the moon god. This is one of the very early attempts to institute monotheism in order to create uniformity. But there was a strong reaction against this king because many people didn't really want to abandon their old customs, their old gods, and they ended up pretty much abandoning this king to his fate. As the Persians, we're going to see the rise of the Persian Empire, of course. As the Persian Empire threatened the king of Babylon, the city of Babylon pretty much abandoned their king because the Persian king promised the people of Babylon that he was going to restore the old gods. So there was a strong reaction against the coming of monotheism, the imposition of this moon god as the only god to be worshipped. And of course, this was a failed experiment, a failed attempt. Now, as I mentioned, there was a desire for predictability during this time. The Babylonians, of course, do not want to live in a chaotic world. Remember, in Mesopotamia, there is this idea of chaos, that the gods are chaotic and are very violent and they're very, very capricious. They can send floods, they can send catastrophes, and they can pretty much destroy entire cities at will. But remember, the Neo-Babylonians are very much concerned with the sky and understanding the cycles of time, and they're becoming excellent, very skilled astronomers. And in this process, they realized that all of the catastrophes that happen in nature happen according to certain cycles of time. And so it is during this time that the Neo-Babylonians are beginning to understand that what happens in nature is not really the byproduct of capricious gods sending floods and calamities to the world, but rather those are the byproducts of celestial bodies encountering or clashing in the sky, planets particularly, eclipses, and they are understanding that whatever happened in the sky is happening here in this world. And now they're trying to predict the future by forming certain calendars and trying to predict future events by knowing the cycles that are coming next, particularly certain lunar eclipses, solar eclipses, and the like. This is something that I'm going to explain more in depth in the next session. We're running out of time now, but in session 3, we're going to continue talking about the dawn of empires. We're going to be looking at the Indo-Europeans and also the Egyptian. And after we finish that, we're going to be moving into the final part 3, looking at the Hebrews. And this is another nomadic group that is coming out of Mesopotamia that is also going to play a key role in creating universal ideas as well, monotheism, something that we're going to get to explore in depth as we come back in session 3. This is all I have for you, and I'll see you in session 3. Thank you.